So yeah, I don't know, this is sort of like cruelty by the conference organizers to put two Troys talking about genetics right after lunch. So hopefully everybody is still awake. I think that Troy's presentation is a really nice complement to what I'm going to talk about, which is the cow side of the equation. In the genetics of the cow that goes to make this whole system more efficient, right? In the two main drivers of cow efficiency, and I'll sort of cycle through this over the next however many minutes, but that's fertility and longevity, the two things that are the absolute most important to commercial cow-calf profitability, longevity and cow fertility, right? So at a repro conference, we're going to focus mostly on the repro traits, some ongoing work in our lab. My PhD student Cassidy Catrett has got a poster out there, and I'll talk just a little bit about some of her work. But in a bigger picture, we've got tools right now that work pretty well to help move the needle on these things genetically. But again, I think that Pedro's slide right off the start, this is a combination of putting animals with the genetic potential to be successful from a fertility and longevity place in the right environment to express that genetic potential, right? If you're missing one of the two, you're never going to have those animals reach that full potential. So we're going to dive right in and start talking about fertility in cows by talking about one of the problems with bulls, right? Anybody who has bulls knows that there's lots of problems with keeping bulls around. But as a geneticist, the problem with bulls is that for things that we know are really important, right? Cow fertility and longevity, these are traits that never get expressed in a bull, right? These are things that I can never look at that bull's phenotype, something like weaning weight. I can look at a bull's phenotype and say, I have an idea about how his calves might perform based on his own phenotype, right? That doesn't happen for things like cow longevity. It doesn't happen for things like female fertility, okay? So we're working uphill here, and the other big challenge is that these traits aren't expressed until well into an animal's life in his daughters, right? So by the time we've made a decision on a bull, and we've kept daughters in that bull, and we've gone on to see if they're going to be successful from a longevity and productivity standpoint, that bull is long gone, right? So the good decisions we get to reap the benefits of, the bad decisions we got to live with for a long time, okay? So our goal in genetics when we start to think about things like longevity and fertility is how do we mitigate the risk of this bull selection decision? Again, whether that's from an artificial insemination standpoint, whether that's from a natural service sire standpoint, we're trying to mitigate the risk associated with this bull when it comes to keeping daughters out of him for the long term. So the big picture and really what my research program, my extension program, they all center on this idea of how do we make breeding decisions that help us breed more profitable and efficient cows. All right, I talk a lot about cow size. I'm not going to talk about cow size and efficiency on forage too much today. We're going to center in on those pieces of fertility and longevity, but there's lots of moving pieces that go into making an efficient cow, and I would argue that efficient cow is overwhelmingly going to be a more profitable cow. So just to break out sort of the four pieces we'll discuss here today, the first is how do we include these things in our breeding objectives? I think that as an industry, we've been very good historically about selecting for traits that increase our revenue, okay? So we're good at selecting for weight, we're good at selecting for live calves. How do we bring in all of these other traits that fit into aggregate profitability into a more comprehensive breeding objective in our herds? The second is how do we do this from the bull side? All right, I'll show some data later on here that the major driver of genetic progress in a commercial herd comes from bull purchases, right? We just can't move the needle through selecting for females in the same way that we can by bringing a bull in who has a very large footprint on our herd. Again, whether that's an AI sire, whether that's a natural service sire. So again, the way that we move the needle on these traits that deal with cow longevity and fertility is through making the right bull purchasing decisions. How do we do that as we sit down and look at those bulls? The third piece will sort of feed into those two. Where are the gaps? What are the things that we can do from a genetics perspective that are missing at the moment, particularly as they relate to fertility traits and phenotypes that we can measure on individuals? And then finally, Troy talked about it at the very end of his talk right there, but how do we use genomics to help inform commercial heifer selections? This is a a really rapidly emerging subject. I get asked to talk more about commercial genomics than any other topic. And it's something I think we need to view not with skepticism, but with a solid understanding of what those genomics tell us and what they don't about that replacement female. So I'm going to jump right into the first part here, and we're going to talk about efficiency, right? And I use this in about every talk that I give, talking about this animal or this farming system as a function of these three things, right? Inputs, outputs, and waste, right? This is a completely closed system when we have these three pieces. And if we want to increase the efficiency, we can hold everything the same and decrease our inputs. Feed efficiency would be the trait that we think about here. If you can hold that output the same but feed something less, that's one way of increasing efficiency. The one that we'll talk about the most today is decreasing the waste in our system, all right? Anytime that we're putting resources into an individual or into our farm, and we have leakage, right, in the form of waste, we're not getting the maximal output compared to that input, that's waste in fertility is the biggest driver of waste in these, again, within animal or within farm systems. So how do we reduce waste? And again, outputs is another more straightforward way for us to increase the efficiency of a system. Hold everything else the same and increase the amount of wean calf or red meat at the end of the day. So again, we're going to focus in mostly on waste here, and again, trying to understand that there are two pieces to this overall profitability equation in a commercial cow herd. The first, of course, is generating revenue. We'd love to have a big check at the end of the year, and we're very, very good at selecting for these traits. We've probably, in our part of the world especially, overshot this live calf piece, right? We have selected for calving these genetics year in and year out, and we've maybe jumped a little bit too far that way, right? We're maybe sacrificing some performance at the price of calving these, right? But again, wean pounds, I think that we do a good job of selecting for these subset of revenue generating traits because they show up in that check that we get at the end of the year. But there's this whole area of female traits that I think get overlooked that are equally important or even more important to the overall profitability of a commercial herd. And so, again, all of these traits related to replacement female success, I think, fall into this waste category. So how do we take a look at our cow herd and identify what a wasteful cow looks like? And the way that I sort of define a wasteful cow is a cow that we put resources into, but she gives us nothing or she gives us less than what we would expect given those inputs, right? And so an open cow, right, we're at a reproduction conference, an open cow is the world's most wasteful animal, right? We give her all of the 100% of the inputs, right? Her contemporary gets the same amount of inputs. We get 0% of the outputs, right? That is a 100% leaky system when we look at this open cow, all right? So if we can reduce these genetically, in addition to all the management interventions that have been talked about today, that helps us move the needle probably more than any one singular thing is to reduce the number of open cows. And again, this is both a genetics thing and a management thing. We're going to focus in on the genetic traits that can avoid waste in this system. So again, I talk about profitable cows, efficient cows, non-wasteful cows. These are the three pieces, I think, of this efficiency equation. Our inputs. So I talk a lot about moderating mature size. That smaller cow, again, when paired with a terminal bull, like Troy talked about earlier, right? We need to have these maternal and terminal lines. But this moderate cow, I can stock a couple more of those maybe. That's better for my entire system's efficiency as her maintenance requirements are liable to be a little bit lower. Milk, this is our big output in this cow system. So we need that cow to milk, but not too much because that push and pull between milk and maintenance requirements, of course, can get to the antagonistic place pretty quickly. So again, these are the input and output pieces, but there are lots of ways that a cow can be wasteful, and I want to sort of walk through all these. Right? Number one, again, fertility. This is a quote from Justin Reinhart, the former reproductive specialist at UT. The return on investment of an open cow is depressingly low, right? All of the inputs, none of the outputs, your ROI on that cow is quite low. But beyond fertility, right, that's probably the number one reason that we cull cows from our herds is that she comes up open during the preg check. But anything that makes this cow leave the herd early, before she's reached her payback period, before she's paid off her development, paid off her annual maintenance costs, so things like structural soundness issues, udder issues, disposition, anything that makes us cull that cow before she becomes profitable is waste, right? That cow is wasteful for us because we've put money into the development and that's leaked out through the form of having to liquidate that cow before she's delivered enough calf for us to pay off all of the costs that have been associated with her. So again, lots of moving pieces to this efficient cow. So developing heifers is expensive. I'm sure that we'll discuss later on in the conference how we do heifer development correctly, but it's expensive, right? If you want to do this right. And I think that makes cow longevity, so a cow that can stay in the herd and continually deliver. She gets bred, she's on that 365-day calving interval. That is the biggest driver of efficiency and overall profitability in a commercial herd, and it all centers on this cow and having to develop less heifers year in and year out. So this is some data that I always like to throw up from some of our econ colleagues at the University of Tennessee, Dr. Chris Boyer, Dr. Charlie Martinez. These are old variable costs. So again, our current day costs you can probably shift those up a couple $100s to what it costs to keep a cow around in this high input world right now. But what these numbers say is effectively, given a variable cost, how many years does it take for this cow to get into the green, right? For us to start making money. She's paid off the costs of her development, she's paid off that annual maintenance cost, and she starts to become profitable. So again, right, in a $550 variable cost, it's not until years 7 or 8 before we start to see that cow become profitable. Any reason that she has to leave the herd early is going to cut away into that profitability, right? And we're never going to see, Dr. Boyer's group did some really nice work here. A cow misses a calf, she's got to stay around until she's 11 or 12 to even sniff profitability across many of these variable cost categories, right? Miss 2 calves and she's never ever going to be profitable. She can stay around until she's 20 and you're still going to lose money in that cow over the big picture. So again, if we can take genetic approaches to help make these cows stay around longer. Again, so much of this is management, but many of these traits are heritable, and we have selection tools that allow us to move the needle on cow longevity. The most straightforward one of these is Stayability. A number of our breed associations are reporting these. I know Angus is getting ready to roll out their functional longevity EPD, which is effectively the same sort of idea here. But this is predicting the likelihood that a bull's daughters will stay in a herd past that payback period, right? So once they reach this green period, right, what percentage of a bull's daughters compared to another sire will end up staying in the herd up to that point, right? We measure this as a percentage. So a 10% difference in stability would mean that we'd expect that higher EPD value to indicate 10% more daughters that reach the end of their payback period compared to the bull with the lower EPD. The thing that you'll hear me talk a lot about, particularly as we move into some of these other measures of fertility, these traits are lowly heritable, all right? So somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% heritability on many of these traits. It's really, really tough, even for a trait that you can directly observe in an individual, to move that through phenotypic selection, right? These lowly heritable traits are tricky, but an EPD allows us to make our selection decisions just focused in on that heritable component of the trait, right? An EPD is the only way to move the genetics of a population forward on a trait like Stayability because of its delayed expression, because it's not expressed in bulls, and especially because it is so lowly heritable. The thing that Stayability does is, again, it's a function of a cow's ability to stay in a herd, not get culled year in and year out. So what that means is it's going to encompass all the different pieces of longevity, all right? So it's not a purely fertility-driven measure. If a cow has poor foot and leg structure and gets cold, that's going to go in as a stayability fail, right? A cow gets cold for udder, disposition, lack of performance. There's lots of potential drivers that are combined up into stayability. But ultimately, it gets at the economically relevant phenotype of cow longevity and is a very, very big piece of selection indexes for all of the breeds that report some sort of a stayability value. But the major component of stayability, and again, my PhD student Cassidy has done some really nice work that I'll talk about here in a second, but when we start to look at the reasons that cows get cold in these big whole herd reporting inventory data sets, the number one driver by and large is fertility, right? An open cow is getting cold. That is overwhelmingly the biggest driver of this. So we have a lot of interest in trying to dig into this fertility phenotype itself and all the reasons that have been discussed before me today of why this is so important, right? Not just a cow getting pregnant and avoiding open cows, but extending calving seasons has an economic cost, right? We have the genetic ability to shift these cows in a genetic direction that makes them get pregnant earlier, more likely to get that first service AI, more likely to get bred that first time she's serviced by a bull. The number one EPD, or the only EPD really on the market in any major breed association right now that directly allows us to select for increased fertility is heifer pregnancy, all right? This is a binary trait. This is a yes or no. Does a female get pregnant during her first breeding season, right? And this is, again, we're thinking about this from sires on to daughters. We're comparing the percentage of daughters that we would expect to get pregnant during their first breeding season between two sires that we're making that comparison on. And so again, this heifer pregnancy is very important. We need that heifer to get pregnant during our first breeding season, but we also know that this is going to have impacts on future fertility, right? A heifer that struggles to get bred is probably going to struggle to get bred as a cow, particularly during that first rebreeding. And again, this is a phenotype that can't be observed in bulls, and it's still, just as stayability, a crossbreed's pretty lowly heritable. So again, we have a couple of selection tools. They're imperfect, but they can certainly help us move the needle and make bull selection decisions that increase the aggregate fertility and longevity of our cows. And so I want to talk just a little bit more about this from the bull side of things, right? This is a topic, again, that I talk a whole bunch about back in Tennessee, is that investing in bulls is the best way that we can move the needle on any trait in our cow herd, right? Whether it's weaning weight, generating more revenue, but particularly on these maternal traits, using the right bull has a really, really big impact. Considering these bulls as an investment is really important as well. So I talk about bulls as risky, right? We're going out, we're purchasing a bull who's maybe never sired a calf before. We're putting a bunch of money into a fixed timed AI protocol. We're purchasing semen. We've set everything up right. We want to make sure that this decision that we've made on the bull that ends up getting used is the right one. So we're shouldering some risk in this scenario, and we have these genetic selection tools in the forms of EPDs, and I'll talk about indexes here in a second, to help mitigate the risk of this decision. This has a big footprint in our herd, and a lot of people would say that it's difficult, right? We've got something like 28 EPDs that the American Angus Association reports now. That's an overwhelming amount for a producer to sift through and make a decision that takes into account all the moving pieces of profitability. So again, we're trying to reduce risk, but at the same time, deliver a tool that's straightforward and interpretable, and understanding the overall magnitude of these decisions. And I throw this up all the time in the state of Tennessee, where we're, again, overwhelmingly natural service and overwhelmingly one bull herds, right? 3 bull purchases in those 1 bull herds account for 90% of the genetic makeup of your current calf crop, all right? That's why Angus Link works so well, right? Is because if we've got a couple generations of information about the sires of an entire pen of calves, we have a pretty good idea about the aggregate genetic potential of that group, right? And the same thing goes as we think about this idea of risk, bringing in the wrong genetics you reap that decision for a couple of generations, right? If you nail 3 bull purchases in a row in this one bull herd, you're sitting pretty, right? Because you've kept daughters, you've kept those granddaughters, right, that are in the herd of a couple bull purchases ago. Again, this perpetuates itself, but it really makes getting the decision right. So we want to use all the tools at our disposal to not just, again, get at these revenue generating traits, but also help make bull buying decisions that are going to have these replacement females that, again, they're going to make up 50% of the herd just like that last bull purchase. We want to make sure that these traits have factored in to the selection decisions that we've made. And so, again, making bull buying decisions or artificial insemination sire selection decisions, we've got to take into account multiple different traits. The tools that we have are these economic selection indexes, right? And what these do is they allow us to put real-world economic weights on multiple different EPDs, weight them together appropriately, account for genetic correlations, and what we come up with is a singular index value. I call these things EPDs for profit, right? They're a direct comparison between the expected profitability of bulls' offspring on a per head basis, right? So again, these make these selection decisions that maybe have 10 or 15 different EPDs that are contributing to profitability. They help make them a little bit more straightforward. We know that stayability is important. We know that weaning weight's important. These allow us to put the correct economic weights on those and select on aggregate profitability instead of trying to piece our way through 15 different numbers, which even the most savvy producer with EPDs has a hard time balancing all those things in their head. And as we think about these fertility traits and cow longevity, these maternal indexes are really good tools for us, especially when we're in situations where we're marketing calves at weaning, no retained ownership. We can focus in on pre-weaning growth, calving ease, and really make some genetic progress on these cow-centric traits. If we have a slightly different marketing endpoint, if we're participating in a program like Angus Link that Troy just got done talking about, we might shift our index to be something a little bit more all-encompassing, right? Put equal sorts of weights on cow functionality traits while not giving up anything on that feedlot performance and in-product merit. And so a number of these different indexes across multiple different breeds. Angus reports one that's a really nice index, dollar maternal. Most all of our different breeds that have some sort of a maternal place in our industry, again, thinking about what Troy talked about, maternal and terminal lines, breeds that have big maternal roles in the industry have probably got an index that is very maternally focused and puts a huge amount of weight on things like heifer pregnancy and cow longevity, among these other traits, including pre-weaning growth, so on and so forth. And so this is the part, we're about halfway through, I guess. And as an extension person, I try not to give silver bullets, right? Things that work 100% of the time, all the time. But I will do that here. And this is something that I talk about very frequently, and that's that across economically important traits, but especially the ones that I'm talking about today, cow longevity and fertility, what's the one way that I can improve all of these at once? A simple decision, doesn't cost me any money. Anybody know? What? No, culling's one. This is even easier than culling. You don't have to make just one decision. Crossbreeding, yeah, this is my favorite thing in the world to talk about is crossbreeding. And as an industry, we do way less crossbreeding than we should. And it's very important as we start to think about making these maternally oriented cows. Crossbreeding is absolutely essential to increasing this right like that, okay? This isn't something that we have to wait 10 years to see the effects of. Crossbreeding is maximized in the first generation, and we tend to see that these lowly heritable traits are the ones that see the biggest effects of crossbreeding in heterosis. Our friends in the corn and field crop industry are experts at crossbreeding. They can take two completely inbred lines, cross them together, and this overperformance in their crossbred offspring is what we would refer to as heterosis, right? That exceeding of the parent line performance in that crossbred offspring. Something similar happens in cattle. We can't have completely inbred lines like we do in corn. They tried at Fort Keogh in Miles City, Montana for a number of years back in the 40s. And once you hit a certain amount of inbreeding in cattle, things start to go awry, it turns out. But we do have these things called breeds, right? And these breeds have been selected divergently over the past couple hundred years. And what that means is that we can cross a sire and a dam line. We have some sort of an expectation of what the average would be between those two. Denote that as the mid-parent value, that little black line. And that excess performance in the crossbred offspring over that mid-parent expectation is what we refer to as heterosis, typically expressed as a function of that parent average and the percent overperformance of the crossbred offspring. And so again, this is where heterosis is really important, is when we start to focus in on traits that are lowly heritable, like cow fertility and longevity, all right? So traits, carcass endpoint, right, marbling, stature, carcass weight, these are all pretty highly heritable in the grand scheme of things. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.5 and up heritability. That tells me that 50 to 75% of the variation in that trait is going to stem from that animal's genetic potential, the balance of that coming from management. So what we see is that in these highly heritable traits, we see relatively low levels of heterosis. So again, for most of our endpoint carcass type traits, those are going to see fairly low amounts of heterosis when we go into a crossbreeding program. Our more growth-related traits, we see they're a little bit more moderate in their heritability, which means that they have a moderate level of heterosis. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% advantage you might see in a trait like weaning weight when you crossbreed two different breeds together. But where we really make our money and where the real value in heterosis is in these maternal traits that tend to be lowly heritable. I talked about 5 to 10% heritabilities. But what we see is that for things like reproduction health, immune function, and cow longevity in particular, we can see anywhere between 10 and 30% advantages due to crossbreeding through heterosis across these traits. So again, the value of the crossbred cow is absolutely enormous, and we're not doing enough structured crossbreeding in our industry. Again, taking advantage not just of heterosis, but also breed complementarity, as Troy talked about earlier. Having maternal and terminal lines, breeds that work, fill in others' weak points, that's a big missed opportunity for us across the industry, but it has a particular impact on these fertility-related traits. So I won't spend too much time talking about the direct heterosis that we see in calves. But again, weaning weight, this is a paper from back in 1999, sort of the foundational paper in estimating heterosis effects from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. Something like a 16-pound advantage in those crossbred calves compared to their straight-bred contemporaries, managed the same way in the same environment. That's a 4% bump that you see from heterosis. And that's free money at the end of the year, right? If you market calves at weaning, that shows up on the balance sheet. But again, the real value of heterosis is in this crossbred female, right? And the big kicker here, right? Someone earlier mentioned that extra calf that a cow might have. Crossbreeding a cow, we're going to expect another 0.97 calves out of her. That's one extra calf out of a crossbred cow over the course of her lifetime compared to a straight-bred cow. It's a 17% advantage in heterosis. You start to layer on the other advantages of heterosis through increased gain, through maternal heterosis of milk, and the cumulative weaning weight, an extra 600 pounds that cow weans off over the course of her lifetime. The only thing that we've changed is that we've introduced another breed into the mix, and we're leveraging heterosis. So again, that extra calf is enormously valuable, right? Not only in that it helps that cow move past that payback period that we talked about that was so important, but you've got one heifer less to develop to replace that cow, and you've potentially got another animal to market as a feeder calf or as an added value replacement heifer because you don't have to replace that cow for an extra year. So lots of advantages to cow longevity that move past just that ability of a cow to move past her payback period. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some work in our lab that are looking at novel measures of fertility phenotypes. Because I think that stayability and heifer pregnancy are really, really great tools, but maybe don't get to all the nuanced pieces of fertility that we know contribute to profitability. So this has been a multi-year large collaboration between our group and the American Simmental Association, taking advantage of their total herd enrollment program. And I'll talk really briefly about this concept of whole herd reporting, total herd reporting. You might hear it called inventory-based reporting. This is a really, really important piece of measuring any of these phenotypes. Without unbiased reporting at the level of a breed association, we can't reliably calculate stayability, heifer pregnancy, or any of the traits that I'm going to talk about for the next couple slides. So traditionally, the way that we've done reporting in purebred populations, so we'll call this the traditional reporting scheme, is we have a cow. She maybe has 6 calves, but this calf was born a couple heat cycles late, so we didn't register that calf even though it was born. Down here, she had a calf, but it was born dead, so we didn't worry about reporting that. And so what this ends up looking like is sort of gaps in this cow's resume over time, right? We can tell that she's had 4 calves, but we're not sure, is this cow a problem from a fertility standpoint? Are these because she was open in years 2 and 6? Did this cow just lose a calf due to a freak accident? What are the moving pieces that underlie that? And what you can see is that trying to make suppositions about this cow's fertility is really, really hard when you have these sort of gaps in her resume. So whole herd reporting schemes are going to just do basically what traditional reporting schemes do, but instead of just reporting calves that end up getting registered at the end of the day, we report records on every calf, and we have an inventory of our cow herd at the start of every season. And so we know, even though this calf in year 2 doesn't get registered, we do know that this cow calved. We know when she calved, and we know probably what happened to this calf that resulted in him not getting registered, right? Gives us a more complete picture of the fertility and productivity history of these animals that aren't just reliant on those calves getting registered. So again, absolutely essential to doing any sort of fertility work on phenotypes across the industry. And so our big question that we set out to answer is beyond things like heifer pregnancy and stayability, can we make selection decisions? Are there heritable traits that allow us to focus in on this anestrus period, right, between when a cow calves and between when she starts cycling again at the start of the breeding season? Lots of moving pieces that we've talked about already today. Some of that we expect is genetic, right? Some cows are predisposed to start cycling quicker, to accept that first breeding more reliably, and we wanted to tease apart the genetic factors that end up doing that. And our big piece that we wanted to get at is this different from heifer pregnancy, right? In genetics, we have lots of tools, but we don't want to make tools that are just repeating what another tool is doing, right? So if heifer pregnancy gets us 90% of the way there to predicting a cow's future productivity from a fertility standpoint, we probably don't need to calculate a new EPD for those traits. And so what Cassidy did is she took that whole herd reporting data and calculated a number of different traits, right? So from things like calving interval, which would be the number of days between calves over the course of a cow's lifetime, to binary heifer pregnancy, so that's just a yes or no, did that cow calve as a 2-year-old. Calving date is going to be more related to where that cow calves relative to the rest of her contemporary group. So we want those cows calving earlier on in the season. And then discrete early calving is a subset of that. Again, just asking, does this cow calve in the first 30 days of the season or not? And one that we're particularly interested in is focusing in on that calving interval between the calves in age 2 and 3, right? So that first and second calf, that rebreeding is really challenging for a cow to get back cycling after the first calf. Are there genetic components that allow a cow to start cycling faster after she's given birth to her first calf in repairing all of her reproductive function? And so, again, this is a really, really large data set. I want to sort of underline that. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 million records across about 300 or 400,000 animals, right? So whereas some of the data shared today is very detailed and they measure everything very precisely, we took the other approach and took a bunch of data of varying quality, I think Cassidy would tell you, and we lump it together and try and tease out some of the big picture trends across this, and it allows us to start to understand the genetic components of these traits. So as we look in here, this is the calving date. So again, where an animal calves relative to the rest of her contemporary group. So that first calf is born on day 0. If our focal cow calves, 12 days later, her calving date would be 12. What we see here is pretty much what we would expect, right? We tend to front load calving in our heifers, probably due to those fixed time day eye protocols, pushing their calving distribution much closer into this first 30 days, whereas in cows we start to see this elongate out. This is probably a function of increased natural service usage across these cows, but also as a cow starts to fall backwards, do we just allow her to keep pushing her calving date out over the course of her lifetime, right? So again, big picture trends. And what this allows us to do is start to analyze these as individual traits. So calving date as its own continuous trait, discrete early calving, so selecting just these animals that calve in the first 30 days. Again, we can tweak how we look at these things, analyze them across the full data set. And then our calving distribution, so this is, again, across all of American Simmental's data, a huge number of animals. We do see that the average right here is around 365 days. So our seed stock producers look like they're keeping a pretty tight calving distribution, but these tails go out a fair bit. And there's this little second bump over here, those cows that got to skip a full year and try again, but that are staying around in their herds. Obviously not ideal. We want to lop this off, but that's still happening a fair bit across this really large data set. Calving interval changes across ages. Again, this is a couple million records, and what we see is about what we'd expect, right? This calving interval between first and second calves is quite large as we try and push those heifers up, give them a little bit more time to recover, and then this remains pretty well flat until it increases out here as those cows reach an advanced age. But again, nothing incredibly surprising as we look across this data. This is probably the most important sort of phenotypic observation across the data that we found. Again, this is a really, really large data set. And what we find is that if a heifer calves in these first 30 days, right? So if you're a heifer and you get bred, you calve in the first 30 days of your calving season, your average calving date as a cow is right around 30 days. For heifers that are born 30 days and beyond, right? So 30 plus days in your heifer calving date, your average calving date as a cow is about 40 days, right? So the only difference here, right? Do you get bred in the first 30 days as a heifer, yes or no? That's worth 10 days in calving date over the course of those animals' lifetimes, right? Getting heifers bred early on in the season has a long-term effect over the course of those animals' lives. This varies wildly, but that 10-day average is worth something, right? 10 extra days of calf growth is really, really important, and this shows up time and time again, no matter how you slice this really, really large data set up. And so the next thing we wanted to do, of course, is estimate heritabilities, and just as with other fertility traits, as we'd expect, these tend to be pretty lowly heritable. Heifer pregnancy, surprisingly high heritability across this data set, about 24%. But everything else is in this 5% neighborhood, right? So lowly heritable, we can make genetic progress on it. We don't just toss it out the window. These are real heritabilities. There is a genetic component, but environment, of course, is going to play a big role in each of these traits. The other thing that we're interested in is how related these traits are to one another. So we don't want to make traits for the sake of making traits up. So we want to understand the genetic correlations. So what amount of shared genetics are there between each of these fertility traits? Very high, of course, between discrete early calving and calving date, because those are subsets of the same trait effectively. But what was really interesting to us is looking across heifer pregnancy, all of these are actually pretty lowly correlated with heifer pregnancy. That suggests to me that there's a pretty different set of genetics that govern a cow's ability to rebreed, not only after her first calf, but throughout the course of her life, that are quite different from a cow's ability to get bred as a heifer. Probably isn't a revolutionary thing for a reproductive physiologist. You guys understand the inner workings of this better than me. But I think that this has some really big impacts as we start to think about how we predict and model these traits in larger populations, is that we probably need to be looking at other economically relevant fertility traits besides just heifer pregnancy. And then phenotypic correlations, these tend to be fairly lowly phenotypically correlated as well, matching those genetic correlations that we calculate across those traits. The other thing that we want to make sure that we do in a genetic selection program is if we start selecting for one trait, we don't want to see it tank another trait. So Cassidy ran some genetic correlations between weaning weight, sort of our chief growth trait, and all of these phenotypes, and they're effectively zero, right? So we're not going to run ourselves into the ditch on growth if we start to select more heavily for these fertility traits in our populations. So what's still missing? This is where I'd like to lobby any breed association people that I ever talk to, and Cassidy does the same thing, right? Having information about breeding dates and any sort of metadata in these whole herd reporting data sets would be so incredibly impactful, right? We have to make a lot of big assumptions about things like gestation date, because all we've got on a calf is its birth date, okay? So we're back calculating everything. There's a lot of missing information about when that cow got serviced, how she got serviced, what was her body condition score, her mature weight, that we would really, really like to model alongside these fertility traits that just aren't required in our current whole herd reporting data schemes. So that's an extra heavier lift for producers, but the information that I think we could squeeze out with a little bit of extra information on things like breeding dates in particular, we could move the needle and make even better selection tools as we think about fertility tools in these populations. All right, and I've got maybe just a couple, I was holding the wrong button there. I've got just a couple minutes left that I want to talk a little bit about commercial genomics and heifer selection. And again, this is something that I talk about quite a bit. I've gotten more and more questions over the last couple of years about commercial genomics as they get commercially marketed more heavily. And I think that there's a place for them, but I really like to sort of temper expectations on these things. They're not silver bullets like crossbreeding is. There's only one of those in this presentation. But traditionally, right, we're sort of moving into a new way of thinking about commercial heifer genetic selection. So the way that we've done this in the past, right, is you buy good bulls, right, hopefully. That's the best way to move the genetics forward of the whole herd. Use some common sense and hope for the best on our heifer selection decisions. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. But I think that there's a lot of common sense stuff that maybe gets skipped over as we keep replacement heifers back that genomics can either add to or detract from. So again, heifer selection, lots of different ways that we can phenotypically select heifers, right? The first and most common sense way to keep back replacement heifers, I would argue, is age, right? That heifer that's a heat cycle older than her contemporaries is going to have an extra heat cycle to mature. She's going to be more likely to get bred. That early breeding, as I said earlier from the Simmental data, says that she'll breed an extra 10 days earlier for the rest of her life as a cow, right? Age is a pretty good phenotypic indicator on keeping this replacement heifer back. Pelvic scores, I don't know how we feel about those here, so I won't say anything about pelvic scores. Dam performance, right? We want to keep good calves out of, good cows. How that animal performed as an individual on her own weaning weight. This is one that I think probably is the overwhelming one. She's got the look. She just looks right. We'll keep her around, okay? And then she's confirmed pregnant, right? We don't want to keep around a heifer that's a reproductive failure, all right? So again, some of these are very good measures. They're good predictors of lifelong fertility and productivity. Some of them are quite subjective, and some of them are maybe useless metrics that the reproductive task force doesn't like. So genomics, I think the benefit from a commercial heifer standpoint is it allows us a more objective view of an animal's genetic potential. right? These are not perfect tools, but they maybe tell us something about that heifer's genetic potential and whether or not she's worth investing the money and keeping around as a replacement, developing, and then all of the maintenance costs associated with her as a cow. So this is where I do a little bit of expectation management on commercial genomic testing. What these things do, they help estimate genetic merit, right? That's what an EPD does. A commercial genomic panel does something similar. I say estimate, so this is an estimate, right? We're using information in statistically inferring an animal's genetic merit. And I say genetic merit because this is not a phenotypic prediction of a heifer's eventual phenotype. And that's really, really important, okay? For a trait, again, like cow longevity, I just said that that's something like 5 to 10% heritable. What this genetic test is telling me is its statistical estimate, so it's got some level of accuracy, it predicting that 5 to 10% of the genetic variation that's eventually get expressed in that trait, right? This is a small piece of the overall picture, right, that's getting predicted by these genetic tests. And these genetic tests are not as highly accurate as the genetics, as a genomic test, a genomically enhanced EPD, in a real genetic evaluation like a seed stock animal would get, all right? But what they can do, again, is they allow us an extra piece of information. It's objective. It's just based on what that animal's DNA tells us and what we can infer from a larger population. And it helps us move this entire distribution forward, right? It doesn't predict phenotypes for individual animals, but on average, if we select with these genomic tests over the course of time in all of our replacement females, we can move the average. This little bell-shaped curve gets shifted over a little bit to the right over the course of time. And so there's sort of multiple tiers, multiple classes of these genomic tests that we talk about. Probably the two most common would be these multi-breed genomic tests from Igenity. That would be the Neogen test and the Inherit Select test from Zoetis. Useful tests, right? They have their pluses and minuses. We also have some straight-bred commercial tests like the GeneMax Advantage, can be designed strictly for straight-bred Angus replacement females. And then there's a level of genetic evaluations for commercial animals. So if you're a commercial producer that keeps records like you're a seed stock producer, these allow your animals to be introduced into national scale genetic evaluations and get EPDs just like you were a Simmental animal or a Red Angus animal, right? So lots of different ways to enter into the commercial genomic testing world. These require some record keeping and reporting. These you pay a flat fee and you're delivered some sort of a genomic score on those animals. One key point that I think gets skipped over a lot is that genomic tests just get done on heifers that somebody's already going to replace, all right? If you've already made the decision to keep these heifers, there's absolutely no need to go out and spend the money on a genomic test, right? This is just really, really expensive confirmation bias, right? So you have to test, I recommend twice as many heifers as you plan to keep if you're going to do this. You've got to be using this as information to make a decision. It can't just be confirming a decision that's already made. Some work that we did at the University of Missouri during my PhD, these things tend to work, right? Again, they're not perfect. You see a lot of spread around each of the slopes of these lines. But on average, if you selected based on these, you could move the needle across a variety of these maternal, growth, and carcass traits. This is based on some data from one of our University of Missouri research stations. But I think the real opportunity here, it gets skipped over some of the side things. Troy mentioned one of the things I'll mention. Heifer selection is important, okay? These tools are important, but again, there's some caveats. They say some things. We have to interpret them correctly. One of the things that these do that I think is really, really important is they'll tell us the percentage of heterozygosity as basically a proxy for the amount of heterosis we'd expect to see in a heifer. That's very, very important in a crossbreeding program, going out and trying to pick the heifers that maximize heterosis, again, knowing those downstream impacts in those crossbred females. But I think probably the biggest thing that these tools can allow us to do is make more informed mating decisions, right? Be a little bit more precise, build up the weak points of a heifer based on her genetic score. With the sire, particularly when we use AI, we can pick and choose sires that fill in those weak spots of heifers that are identified by these commercial genomic tests better. So again, this is one big benefit that I think doesn't get talked about enough, is that these can help us make bull buying or AI sire selection decisions more tailored towards the individual pluses and minuses of a female. And then I think that Troy did a great job sort of tempering the idea of adding value to feeder calves. I think we're not far off from using genomics to help place and individually manage feeder calves, right, in a more precise way. But if we can connect these feeder calves back to their genetic potential, possibly some ways that we can squeeze that extra information out. And so the last thing that I'll sort of mention about this, and I always talk about bull buying, right? Selecting bulls is overwhelmingly going to be the thing that moves the needle, right? So this is some simulations that I ran in my spare time. And what I simulate basically is in blue, a seed stock population, in green, a conventionally, randomly selected commercial heifer population, and then red is a group of heifers that are genomically tested, and hopefully we're getting a little bit more accurate selection in those animals. The key here, right, is that the driver, the slope of these lines, so genetic change over time, that slope comes entirely almost from that seed stock population, right? The footprint that a bull has in a herd is enormous, right? So getting that decision right is by far the most important thing, right? So somebody comes and asks me about commercial genomic testing. I ask them, are you buying the best bulls that you possibly can in your part of the world, right? If the answer is no, then I would suggest that they spend a little bit more on bulls, because that's going to overwhelmingly be the thing that drives this genetic trend over time. We see maybe just a little bit of a jump in this initial generation through genomic testing, but the overwhelming driver of genetic progress comes from the bull side of things. So again, these genomic tests help a little bit, and I think that they can really help as we try and optimize mating decisions, but that bull is going to continue to be the major driver of genetic progress in commercial herds. And then using these genomics as a tool and not in place of common sense things is really important, right? We can't ignore things like heifer age, heifer dam productivity, right? These genomics tell us a piece of that, but that heifer's actual performance has something to say about how she'll function as a cow over the course of her life. All right, I've got a couple takeaways there, my contact information if I can ever be of any help, and I'll answer some questions if you've got any here.
All right, let's thank Troy. We got time for a quick question here.
I think my question is from a geneticist perspective. How many generations before I see the pickup of the negative or recessive genes when I'm applying heterosis? And is that going to affect positively or negatively that cow longevity and fertility?
Yeah, so let me make sure I got your question right. How many generations of selection within a seed stock population before you start to see those, or when you're crossbreeding? Yes. So we tend to think of those deleterious variants, so whether they're sort of, congenital genetic diseases, right? Your curly calves, your hydrocephalies, whatever, those are big, aggressive-looking genetic malformations. More often, I think that those show up in seed stock populations as decreases in fertility due to lethal haplotypes, right, or lethal genetic variants getting matched up together. So that embryo doesn't even get a chance to develop past a certain point because those two recessive mutations have matched up. There's no surefire way to say. It's going to vary from breed to breed, but we tend to want to try and manage around inbreeding. You can line breed with some success, but understanding that some of those things might show up just as slight decreases in fertility, but really they're embryonic lethals that are driven by genetics. We think that, or we know that crossbreeding mitigates much of that for a number of generations, right? A single introduction of a new breed can sort of wipe out the vast majority of those and allow you to sort of move forward without having to worry too much about matching up those recessive genetic defects.
Could I just ask two questions?
Sure.
How do you maintain a high level of heterosis in a maternal crossbred line? Is it the 3 or 4 breed rotation? And
Yeah. I didn't talk a ton about how you maintain the maximum amount of crossbreeding or the maximum amount of heterosis in a crossbreeding program. We have this sort of push and pull between crossbreeding system complexity. So, like you said, a 3 or 4 breed rotation. The more breeds you bring in, the more breeding pastures you've got to have, the further out of reach that is for a small producer. But you retain more of that heterosis from generation to generation. For a lot of small producers in this part of the world, in Tennessee in particular, I think that we would do well to buy more F1 replacement females, right? Lots of small one bull herds trying to make 3 or 4 replacement females every year. When you could go out, maybe purchase, it's going to cost you a little bit more, but you get maximum heterosis. You can bring in a third, more terminal breed type. So lots of ways to make that happen. But I think that as an industry, in a lot of places, we might do better trying to purchase more replacement females than trying to make everything in-house, especially when we can't ramp up the complexity like in a 3 or 4 breed cross.
just another quick question. Those commercial genomic tests,
Yep.
are they as accurate for a Bos indicus influenced herd as typical Bos taurus herd?
Yeah, that's a good question. And typically my answer would be no there, just because the overwhelming amount of data that's gone into training those markers that they use the marker effects for are going to be done in primarily Bos taurus influenced herds. So I would expect a little bit of a drop off if it's not a test designed specifically for those more Bos indicus type cattle. Great question. Yep.
Great. Let's thank Troy one more time. And